First of all, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's book launch. I'm Albert Lowe. I'm the author of The Five. I think I'd like to begin by first thanking everyone for coming. There's a lot of different ways you could have spent your Sunday evenings, so I'm really grateful you could all take out the time to learn more about just a few books that some high school students wrote. So for my presentation today, just to break it down, I'll be describing a little bit about the introduction to my book. I'll talk about the background of where I drew my inspiration, and a brief summary of what it's actually about. I'll discuss the process of writing it, so my motivations for writing The Five and the bumps I encountered along the way. I'll move on by offering some of my personal advice on writing creatively, but also writing in general. And I'll conclude with a short reading that I've selected from my novel. So I think just to begin, a valuable way to start is to just read the synopsis that is featured at the back of my book, because I think it gives a good sense of what the book's about, and it goes as follows. A vengeful foe, a crumbling kingdom, the final hope resting in the feeble palms of four intrepid children, chosen by prophecy for their powerful elemental abilities. Jack, Linda, Sky, and Kyle. And yet, these ill-fated adventurers will soon learn that it will take more than four to save the kingdom from the mysterious evil that threatens their homes. So The Five, what is it actually about, and why did I decide to write it? So the story of me actually writing this novel is really the amalgamation of all sorts of different captivating stories that I had heard and I had read when I was a child, younger child, into a single thrilling story of my own imagination. So the idea for The Five came to me first when I was actually in middle school, as my mom mentioned. I was still in the early years of middle school, and I really wanted to write a novel about characters I designed and a story that I was personally invested in. And to me, there was no better way to do that than to write my own book. And so at the time, I was actually reading a lot of Percy Jackson. I was invested in Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is a TV show. And I was also getting into dystopian stories like The Hunger Games. And so there's hints of all those elements in The Five. The story begins with a selection process to find the prophesized heroes of the kingdom, similar to The Hunger Games. These heroes bear powerful abilities similar to Avatar, and they must traverse an unfamiliar land full of mysteries similar to Percy Jackson. And so The Five was my attempt to create a story I thought was missing in the world. And that was a story that had all the best elements from the books and the stories that made my childhood all the more enjoyable for me. So I hope that sounds intriguing. I don't want to give too much of the story away. I will do a reading further on, but I'll leave the summary there and I'll move on to my writing process. But by all means, if you do have any questions about the story, or if you like more information, you can ask during the Q&A. So the process of writing The Five is quite interesting, as my mom had described. I've always loved to read and write. I began by drawing and writing my own comic books when I was probably still in kindergarten. I became invested in the creative process of coming up with my own stories. And as simple as it sounds, I was really invested in this since I was practically a toddler. So for the first probably 14 or so years of my life, I was extremely into fiction. I would only ever read fiction and only ever write about fictional stories. And again, what drew me to fictional stories was the ability to really create my own world, in my own world, in my own making. And that was the thing that really excited me. So in sixth grade, I wrote the first version of The Five, as my mom mentioned. It was around 20,000 words, and it's still quite a feat that I'm impressed with myself, with my sixth grade self. But I do admit that first version was a mess. There was zero character development. The pacing was always really fast, and the things that happened in the story sometimes didn't make a lot of sense. But for the 12-year-old me in sixth grade, and some of the classmates and hockey teammates I had shared the story with, the story was fantastic. Because every chapter I would sneak in a fight scene or have something really exciting happen, because that was what entertained me as a middle schooler. And in the end, I think that's what it boiled down to. I wrote because I enjoyed writing for myself. And I enjoyed being able to manipulate all the things that excited me in the stories and books that I read into my own story. But as I matured and as I entered high school, I realized just how silly many of the components in the story were, and I thought it was worth a try to fix the novel that had once so captivated me. So I spent months revamping the entire story, starting from page one, chapter one. I spent time developing the characters, making the world that they lived in more relevant, more believable, and keeping all the excitement that existed before, but adding softer tones where I could better construct the bonds between the protagonists and the tension that they experienced, even when there's little action going on. And so that's a good segue actually into the personal advice I have in terms of how writers can get into writing, if you're new or if you're just looking for some suggestions. And I think simply put, you just have to write. Your first draft will never be perfect. Something I actually struggled a lot with in writing this book was perfectionism. That was not something I struggled with as a 12-year-old. I pumped out that 20,000 word novel in a few months because I never looked back and I kept writing. And I would have fared much better with this version if I just sat down, wrote everything that came to my mind, and only looked back to review and improve. And so my suggestion for writers is to set out times during the day to write. For example, from 8 to 9, you are writing. And anything that comes to mind, you just write it down and repeat it the next day. And this just doesn't go for novels. It applies to academic essays, articles. It could apply to memoirs or poems, or really any form of text your mind can think of. Personally, I've recently engaged myself with a lot of creative nonfiction. So I read a lot of personal essays and memoirs, and those are of interest to me right now. And I find that especially with those, in terms of creative nonfiction, there's a lot of spontaneous writing that goes on about literally anything I found interesting during the day. And so I think that the beauty of writing and why I enjoy it so much is it emerges when you are most vulnerable, when you don't have a pre-written comprehensive plan. And even in those cases where you do have a plan, the plan itself is usually a result of open brainstorming, of jotting anything you can think of down on a piece of paper. And so my advice would be just to write. So before I go into my reading, there's a few thank yous I'd like to offer. So I want to, first of all, thank you to my parents for supporting me throughout the years on any of my writing endeavors. And secondly, I want to thank Yolanda and Catherine, who were my illustrators for the 5. And they worked tirelessly, and we went back and forth several times for multiple drafts of the drawings. And in the end, they produced really amazing artwork that elevated the novel to a whole new level. So with that, I'll begin my reading, and afterwards, I'll pass it on to the next speaker. I hope you enjoy. The leaves began to rustle once again. Kyle ran. His limping jog transformed into a sprint. He could sense others had followed. In the distance, he could make out the form of a building, a castle. This must have been where the sword was guiding him. He could not dare look back. What had been a single pair now sounded like dozens of pairs of steps rushing towards him. Kyle heard the familiar screech. He hastened his rhythm. The castle drew closer. Guards had been stationed atop the walls. Help, please, open the gates. Kyle furiously waved his arms. It was no use. The station guards could neither see nor hear his cries for help. As Kyle continued to run, he gathered his energy and fired a beacon of flames into the sky. They were slow to react, but Kyle could see the guards scramble. Perhaps they too had seen what lay behind him. A thin gap of light appeared along the wall. The castle gates were opening. He was being let in. Kyle's heart pounded out of his chest. His thighs tightened in pain with each stomp against the soil. His vision grayed. Kyle lunged through the stone walls before hearing the crunch of the gates shutting behind him. He rolled onto his back. A crowd gathered around him, all in colorful uniforms. An older member of the crowd approached, dressed in red. She looked to be a Pryden. With his remaining strength, Kyle raised the scrap of black cloth into the air. The Pryden removed her hood and lowered her domino mask. Her face contorted with a dread Kyle had never seen. Dear God, it's begun. Thank you.
Emily, if anyone is ever stressed about deadlines, imagine having your publishing company as your mother. It's damaging to your soul. So I think my story explores like the biggest moral quandary or meme of our generation, or my generation, which is like, what is the meaning of life and what is the purpose of life? Although this is obviously like a joke on, in every school, right? People like talk about, hey, have you discovered the meaning of life? I think that it does play a big part in a lot of our life choices. And for a lot of youth, I think people just find that life is pretty meaningless and pretty purposeless, because when you have access to so many different resources, you don't demand like certain like life necessities. And when you have so many areas to explore, oftentimes it can be like very like, your mind just goes everywhere. You don't know which path to go on. So I try to explore this idea by making it a little bit more crueler. I set it into 18th century during the Industrial Revolution, where most people who have an ordinary life literally live in a world where their job is their entire life. And oftentimes this job is pretty bad, right? So you're probably going to be working in a factory, most likely, if you live in a city. And if you live, in the countryside, you're going to be working on a farm the entire time. And your entire life, so 50, 60 years, will be like this. So what is the meaning of life for them? How cruel is it for them to be doing this exact same thing every single day, eating probably the exact same meal every single night and waking up the exact same time every single morning? I think that, when we think about it like this, perhaps our life of meaningless is not so meaningless after all, because I think pretty much everyone, even in today, have it far worse than us. And I try to explore, how characters even back then can bring some more purpose to their life. So just more on some character specificity, I have two main protagonists, Edward and Eve. So Edward is representing, or has lived essentially the ordinary life. He was an orphan back young, so he has experienced like the crueler side. So this is set in London in the 18th century. So he's obviously experienced the crueler side of being homeless, a homeless orphan. But Edward is unique because he appreciates the ordinary. He appreciates, the grind of working your day-to-day job. He appreciates working in the factories. He appreciates working on the docks where, you're kind of like bullied in a way by your peers, by the older men who are working alongside you. And it can be pretty rough at times, but somehow he enjoys this. And then he meets Eve. Eve is the complete opposite of Edward. Eve is the rich girl, living in central London, who has everything, and she is very spontaneous. She is super optimistic about the future. She's kind of like your young Reddit philosopher of today. She wants to live in a utopia. And when Edward meets Eve, Eve kind of wants to save Edward, because she sees, hey, this guy who I kind of like, he's a friend at first, but maybe something more later, is living a pretty bad life. I want to take him to my life. I want to save him. But actually, in the end, Edward ends up saving Eve, because I don't want to say the moral story, but I think a very important thing about valuing what is important in our life is kind of like valuing relationships we have with each other. So even if even if Edward was not in the best place economically or financially or by any like lifestyle means, he had strong relationships with people he cared about, and that brought meaning into his life that Eve, who is rich, who is spontaneous, kind of doesn't have. So this is kind of, one of the values I really cherish within my own life, and I try to reflect into my story. So a little bit about the inspirations for this story. So when I was maybe like 3-4 years ago, I really enjoyed like reading YA books, and then I later expanded on to more of the classics. And whenever I read a book I really enjoy, it's kind of like an escape from reality. Whenever you read a book that you really connect with, the characters you can really empathize with the characters, you are taken into a different reality, and you can really appreciate life on a higher scale. It's like, because obviously the books are constructed to like oftentimes exaggerated, so you can experience relationships on a purer level. You can experience like meaning and purpose on a pure scale. So whenever I read, I feel like I also grow a little bit older, because I experience the characters' experiences, even if it's fictional. And I really wanted to bring this kind of connection within my own book. I want to like establish the connection with the reader and really make you feel like you're experiencing what we're experiencing, and then take it back into your own life and try to develop some meaning in that sense. I also was really inspired by a lot of authors. Right now, I'm trying to get back into Hemingway. I read that when I was younger, but I didn't really understand him. I really like how a lot of these stories can teach a moral or some really important lesson about life without really hinting at it. You kind of have to explore it yourself, right? When after you read it, you kind of ponder about the story, you ponder about the characters and their relationships and the plot. And then the more you delve into it, the more you kind of appreciate the life that the character has lived. And I think that this is very important. Like for me, I feel like I've learned more about myself, or like perhaps like myself growing up, in stories than in my actual life. Although this might not be true for everyone, especially if you have a more adventurous life than me, I think this is, this is something everyone can take away from a book. You can really learn something and grow. And for me, I've grown the most within books, and I hope to bring that within my own story. So now onto the advice part. I think my advice is pretty similar to Albert and Yunkai's. It's just that don't be too much of a perfectionist. I've always struggled with kind of rewriting the same thing over and over and over and being too scared to share my writing with other people. If it helps, close your eyes after you've written a story or a page, or even a paragraph, and then just share with someone you trust to not critique you too hard. Obviously this person might vary, and sometimes you might have bad experiences, but most of the time people are very nice. And the more you share your work with other people, the more you actually feel encouraged to write yourself. So just don't be too shy and believe in yourself. Okay, then I'll be reading a little bit of my own story. Edward. A single voice calls out into the void. Vomit sloshes gently across the boat deck. The fluid, the accumulation of several days' worth, covers its victim's body, slowly sinking to their skin, turning their scent into bile. She sat bundled in the center. A man's trench coat, worn and steadily losing its yellow sheen, protected her from the prevailing sea breeze and cold rain. In her lap sat an iris flower, protected and hidden from sight. Blue petals and a strong green stalk stood proudly, a spectacle of blue and gray against the gray contrast. Okay, now finally my acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Echo, my mother, for supporting me the entire journey. She has given me a lot of feedback and has really encouraged me. I also like to thank my illustrator, Cynthia, for really expanding beyond her limits in terms of apps, in terms of art style. We've communicated so many times, and she has listened to my ideas, and we've discussed for many hours about how to best represent my story. So I really appreciate her dedication. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Because of my parents' incessant nagging for me to consume more content, especially chapter books. Looking back, I am extremely thankful for this opportunity that they granted me. I was able to learn a lot, especially at an early age. And due to that, I'm able to stand here now and proudly publish my first book. So, much like Albert, I'll be talking about similar subjects, mostly how I got here, what troubles I faced, and finally, what my book is really about and what inspired me to write it. Growing up, I had read a lot of extremely long, complicated books with extreme plot twists, as one would say. Some of the most memorable ones are similar to the ones Jaden and Albert read, such as Percy Jackson or Harry Potter. We both know the authors of these books, Rick Riordan and J.K. Rowling, both authors of who I still follow to this day. I eagerly await for their new books, and it's um, mostly a matter of time before I uh, pre-order the next one and read it within a few hours. And so, growing up reading a lot of these books, after you read many of these bestsellers, you start having a certain expectation for books. And so, when I started reading some less commonly known books, I especially noticed plot holes and certain parts I would have liked to change about the story. And that's what inspired me to start writing, especially at a younger age of around grade 3 or 4. And it also helped that I had great peers who were also very passionate about writing since they were consuming basically the same content as I do. I remember meeting up with them after school or on the car and very excitedly talking about some fan fiction that we were going to write together. Of course, it never worked out as we had a lot of conflicting ideas, but I still think it's a really integral part of how I started writing and how I was able to come up with my own story. And so, as of right now, I've gotten into a lot of anime and manga, and I've found out that they're not really too different from books. They have the same complex plot. They simply choose to express their stories in a different way. Now, I'd like to call out a couple of anime PFPs or profile pictures I see in the audience. I see from manhwa like something about us, or I'm pretty sure that's 2020 Street Kid Kakashi, or I might have gotten that wrong, but um, I see that anime and manga has had a huge impact on people, and it's also made an everlasting impact on me. Um, Huge stories such as Attack on Titan have really sparked my interest due to their very extravagant and complex plotline. And I wanted to include that in my own personal story, which is what inspired me to write something that's different from the norm, as some people would call it, or to derive from cliches. The cliche of having the main character have everything work out for them, of having that really emotional last scene where they get all fired up and then they succeed with the power of friendship and love or whatever. I wanted to derive from that, which is why I wrote my own story, the story of Unnaturally Tainted, where the main character isn't really the heroine that most stories incorporate. And so I would like to take this time to thank the people who have gotten me here. I would like to thank my peers for helping me edit my story, for uh, waking up really late at the dead of night to help me and to basically read over my stories and take time out of their busy schedules. I would like to thank my parents for their unwavering support, even when it felt like everything wasn't going so well with the story, and I wanted to restart a lot of plot. And thank you for helping me publish this book. I would like to thank Skyky Publishing for giving me this amazing opportunity and for inspiring my parents and I to begin this incredible journey. Now, I must admit that I stumbled upon quite a lot of, you know, like very obvious roadblocks. I would like to think I'm not a perfectionist, but that would be kind of optimistic. uh, Whenever a chapter doesn't feel right, I would go back and edit it only to realize that I'm obsessing over minor details, and oftentimes it would screw up my overall plot. And so I like to think of writing a book as writing backwards, because you have to allude to what's going to happen in the future in your very first book. Your very first book should have close ties to your like the final book in your series. And I find details like these extremely like they're very hidden in most books. Let's take an example from Percy Jackson, for example. I'm sure a lot of you have read it, but if not, I would like to give a spoiler warning. But basically, in the first book, when Percy first arrives at the camp he stays to train at, there's a single sentence in a very unnoticeable paragraph where he remarks on the goddess of the hearth. He sees her as a young girl standing next to the hearth in Camp Half Blood. And later in the fifth book, Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian, we find out that the goddess of the hearth is the last Olympian, and she has a very significant role to play in the final plot. And she calls out Percy. There's a single sentence saying, Percy Jackson was the first person to have ever acknowledged me at Camp Half Blood. And I think it's moments like these that are really cool, where the first book alludes to the final book. And when, especially when rereading these series, you tend to pick up on small details like this. And I really wanted to um, essentially copy that in my own book. where I alluded to a lot of the future plot in my first book. And so now I would like to read an excerpt from my book in order to give you guys a taste of what is in my book, I guess. And it goes as follows. The man grinned, folding one leg over the other as he draped his arm over the back of the sofa. The padding torn as if a great beast with claws and fangs had ripped through it in a hurricane of rage. The radio faded into silence, the soft static vibrating throughout the room as the antenna slowed to a stop. So X is dead. He couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face like poison, turning itself into a giggle, and then laughter. Once more, he had gained ultimate control. Once more, he had squashed resistance. A minor headache had begun to form, and the man rubbed his temples. Weak, he thought to himself. He had to get stronger, had to be better to maintain the proper order of things. It was his duty, and he would die to fulfill it. Because in this world of chaos, he was the only one strong enough to bring order and peace to a nation of warmongering people, made all the more powerful by their abilities. He sighed, the headache growing more potent. And that's all I'm going to share. You'll have to find out more by reading my book.